ArtAvalon Real Brush Pens are versatile tools that can be used in different ways to create many different types and styles of art. This is the final video of this series. You don't have to be an expert to understand it. If you are, then you already know all the stuff anyway, but I will be going more in depth about materials and techniques to use with this medium. I'm going to take a very watercolor approach to these pens in this video. Last video, we went over a couple ways to dilute and mix colors with these pens using the water brush, using a palette to dilute the ink before applying it, and laying water down before depositing the ink straight onto the page. The wet on wet method makes the ink feather into the water on its own, making it easier to create softer transitions without having to worry about the ink drying too quickly. If you let the color bleed into the water by itself, this is called blooming. You can get some cool transitions with this technique. While the ink is still wet, you can manipulate it with your brush to adjust the feathering if you'd like. You can also blend the pens into each other directly on the paper, just like you would markers. This is the best method for blending them together at full saturation. Another watercolor method of mixing colors is to glaze layers of ink over each other. You can see how a plain wash laid straight from the pen allows for different tones to show through depending on how much color is underneath. You can see it better with a more transparent wash of ink on top. You can also glaze as many layers over as you want. To demonstrate, here's a little piece where I used a lot of soft blooming in the background, then layered some flat graphic style plants over that using a little bit of glazing to control the saturation of the leaves. I used direct blending on the butterflies as well since I wanted the piece to feel fun and vibrant. To get a little more into glazing, I find it very helpful to look at how each color breaks down as it's diluted. In a swatching chart, I find that a few of the colors look very similar at full saturation, but if you take those colors and blend them out into a gradient, you'll find that they break down quite differently. For example, these blues, these oranges, and these reds look very similar to each other at full saturation. But when you dilute them down, of these two blues, the one on the right has a very purple base. In the pair of oranges, one is more peachy and the other yellowish. And the red on the right in this pair is quite a bit more orange than on the left. One that tends to have a more interesting breakdown is black. As you continue to move it and let it absorb into the paper, you'll find that it starts off fairly neutral, but then kind of separates into a little bit of warm but mostly cool grays. So when mixing colors to darken or desaturate them, keep in mind that mixing in black for value will cool the color down quite a bit, as you can see here. The gray is much more neutral, but of course you can't get the same value with it. I could only match the black wash by laying the gray down straight from the pen. If you want it to stay warm, you might use the dark brown instead, like this. But that is very warm, so if you want a more neutral tone than that, you'll probably want to combine the black with another color. On the right here, I've just mixed in a little bit of orange and light brown to the black to warm it up a little bit, which does bring it much closer to the neutral gray. The order that you lay the colors down will also impact the final color. Here's a little chart to demonstrate using just the primary colors arranged and glazed over each other in columns and rows. You can glaze a color over itself to build the saturation up, or glaze with a different color to mix the two. The color that you lay on top will be the more visible part of the mix, even though the components are the same. It's easier to see when the colors are side by side. Each secondary color is closer to the primary color that's on top. Here are some miscellaneous things to keep in mind while painting with these pens. Overworking a wash can make the result unpredictable. Continuing to work at a wash after you've already laid it down but before it dries can mess up the edges a little bit. If there's too much water in your glaze, you're likely to pick up more pigment from your bottom layer than you lay down with the top. If there's enough pigment in your glaze but you lay way too much of it down, you'll get hard edges in addition to bleeding. This is more apparent if I let it air dry, which with this amount of water is going to take forever, but good thing this is a video and we can fast forward. That was easy. The top example is definitely not as obvious, and sometimes it might be worth the risk to correct an uneven wash. Here's another very extreme example where you can better see the edge bleeding. Also be careful that your glaze is either fully wet or fully dry when you work on it. If I glaze over before the bottom layer has quite finished drying, it becomes uneven and the edges bleed all over the place. But if I make sure it's completely dry first, it's much cleaner. Once you lay some pigment down on the page, as we've demonstrated before, there is some movability to it. With this comes removability. Say you want some white clouds and a blue sky, but you forgot to leave room for them when you laid the ink down. So, drop some plain water on top of your wash where you want to lighten it. The pigment will be reactivated, and then you can blot it away with a rag. You can't erase completely by doing this. You will always have some amount of staining, and some colors do stain more than others, so keep that in mind. Staining isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I'm going to take advantage of it later. Let's talk about what to look for in a watercolor paper. There's a lot of variety out there, and this will be one of the things that impacts your painting experience the most. I find that there are three main factors to consider when choosing a paper. I did a series of tests to demonstrate some of the differences in these papers. In the corner, I put down some pencils so you can see the tooth and the texture. At the left here, I have three different blending tests. On top, I laid a block of color and allowed it to dry completely before later coming back to see how much of it I could move around. Next, I did two gradients, the hard version being ink first and the easy version being water first. At the bottom middle is a staining test, where I attempted to lift as much from a completely dry block of color as I could. Next above that is a surface tearing test. I dropped some pigment and a lot of water, and then agitated it with a water brush to see how long it took the paper to pill up and how badly. Side note, please don't put your brushes through as much abuse as I am in this video. I'm doing it purely for demonstration purposes, it's poor technique, I'm really scrubbing to try to get most of these to pill. I'm trying to accomplish in a few seconds what you might if you re-wet and rework the paper several times over several hours. Though these brush nibs are very durable, no brush is impervious to damage, and the better care you take of yours, the longer it will last. Okay, moving on. The top is a buckling test using a ridiculous amount of water. I've added some pigment to it so you can see better, and I left it to air dry. Also, this lets you see how well the paper grabs the pigment as it dries. And then finally, I did a simple drawing with thick and thin lines to see how well the paper handles line art. The three factors I was testing across these papers were weight, texture, and material. Weight seems to make the most obvious difference, so let's start with that. It's usually marked in both pound weight and grams per square meter. Pound weight is sometimes inconsistent, so I'm going by grams in this video. The most common weight for watercolor paper is 300 grams. It's quite heavy, which allows the paper to hold more water and be more forgiving. In comparison, a lighter watercolor paper of 200 grams buckles and pills pretty easily. Lighter paper like this is better for sketchbooks and throwaway tests. For thoroughness' sake, I also got my hands on a 600 gram paper. It's expensive and sometimes difficult to find and also overkill for most people, but boy, it is nigh indestructible. The texture will also be more pronounced on the heavier papers. These are all meant to have the same type of texture, but there's less material to create it with on the thinner paper, so you can see it doesn't have as much tooth as the other two. You'll also see that lifting and moving ink gets easier the heavier you get. This is due in part to the weight, but has more to do with the materials of the paper, which I will get into in a bit. Watercolor paper comes in three different textures: rough, cold press, and hot press, which are exactly what they sound like. Rough paper is rough. It's not pressed flat when they make it, it's just left to dry. On the other end of the spectrum is hot pressed paper. They more or less iron it smooth with a heated press. In the middle you'll find cold pressed paper. It's pressed smoother than rough paper, but it's not heated during the process, so it keeps a respectable amount of tooth, and it's what most people have in mind when they think of watercolor paper. Across this texture spectrum, you will more or less be choosing between durability and detailability. While hot pressed paper is still made to hold water, it will pill and buckle relatively easily compared to the other two. It's also less porous. Because of this, it is less forgiving and stains more. However, it takes line work and fine details very well, and allows for more precise, controlled work, as well as very smooth gradients, if you're good at making them. Turning again to the opposite end, rough watercolor paper is very forgiving. Of the three, it buckles and pills the least, and because it remains quite porous from not having been pressed, it's the easiest to pull pigment up from. Because of the texture, however, it's difficult to deposit ink straight onto it, and any line art applied to the paper will reflect that. Rough paper is best for looser, heavier applications. With the middle ground cold press paper, you're going to get a balance of durability and control. Clean, crisp line art might be a bit much to ask of it, but your washes will stay where you put them more easily. It'll stand up to a fair bit of overworking and abuse. This balance makes it somewhat more versatile than the other two. Lastly, the materials the paper is made out of will also affect things quite a bit. One thing to look for is paper made out of cotton. Cotton paper is much more durable than regular wood pulp. It may be listed as rag instead of cotton. There's technically a difference, but you don't usually see it specified. Take a look at the difference in pilling between cotton versus wood pulp cold press. While I was able to get both of them to pill in the end, the pulp broke down much more readily than the cotton. Another difference in materials you'll encounter is sizing. To simplify it down, sizing is the glue that holds the paper fibers together and keeps the paper from absorbing too much pigment and water. And this is the other main factor I was talking about earlier when comparing the heavier and lighter papers. This is a bit more tricky to look for since each brand has its own recipe, and they typically don't advertise it, so you'll probably go by reviews and trial and error. Typically, more expensive papers will have more durable sizing, but not always. These are both 300-gram cold press papers. They're both wood pulp, so the only difference between them is the sizing. You can see that one of them is noticeably more durable than the other. I also wanted to quickly mention illustration board. It's usually pricier, but I did really like how they handle these pens. The board on the right is a regular board, and on the left is a board for wet media with a cold press surface. Cold press on an illustration board is not as heavy of a texture as on paper, so it's good for more detailed line art while still handling water pretty well. The boards are a little bit flimsy in regards to surface pilling, but otherwise hold their own here, mainly the wet media board. Both are nearly impervious to buckling though. Keeping the differences of the papers in mind, I wanted to show two examples using what we've talked about in these videos. The first is a simple little painting over a little sketch. Because I was going for a looser style and I knew I'd want to use a lot of water to achieve that, I chose the big 600-gram cold press paper. I kept having to rework my glazes due to accidentally watering them down too much, so having a durable surface resistant to pilling was very useful here. After laying down the loose painting layer on the bottom, I went in directly with the purple pen to define some areas and to put in a few smaller details, and let's be honest, in order to cover up my mistakes. While the more textured papers don't lend themselves very well to fine detail, they don't keep you from being able to do it at all. It just takes a little extra time and care. Now I do prefer to use these pens for pieces that require a bit more tight control and detail. For me, I think this is where their abilities really shine. For this other demonstration piece, I went to hot press watercolor paper and inked this character with water-fast pigment liners. I tried to work in fairly light, flat washes and simple gradients, building the colors to the intensity that I wanted while being able to adjust the hue along the way. The colors in these pens are very bright and loud, but I imagined this character to be very serious and dramatic, and I needed to give her a color scheme that fit. So I used the browns, gray, and black to dull the saturation and intensify the values of the colors, especially with her armor and weapons. This is where keeping in mind the base breakdowns of each color comes in handy. For example, the yellow trim around the edges of her armor I pushed to be more brassy by overlaying that neutral gray. For her armor I had in mind a color similar to the more purpley ultramarine blue in the set, but not quite so bright. Kind of wanted it to be like an anodized titanium blue. So, to get a similar hue with less saturation and slightly darker value, I alternated the more cobalt blue with a darker brown. The red tones of that particular brown pushed the blue more to the purple side that I wanted, while the dark oranges, also present, helped to sufficiently mute the complementary blue a little bit. If I wanted to mute or change the hue of a lighter color, I glazed over with a wash that would adjust the hue the way that I wanted to, and then used a rag to lift the excess pigment. The top glaze will still stain the paper, so you can still mix colors this way. I did this with her undershirt and pants because my first wash was a little bit stronger than I had intended, so lifting what I could helped me quite a bit. The other trick I used in this piece was to wait till after I had colored the painting before finishing the line art. I like to weight my line art a little bit heavier, so that allowed me to hide a few mistakes where I'd colored outside the lines or accidentally let a color bleed into another one. I do this a lot. And so here's what the painting looks like now that it's finished. I had a ton of fun playing around with these pens and making these videos, and I hope that they were a little bit helpful and informative at least. I also hope that you have just as much fun playing around with these pens as I did. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!